Welcome everyone to this webinar on palliative care and psilocybin. We are here with Tony Bossis. My name is Philip Bromberg and I'm the Executive Director of NPV. And I'm going to hand over to Tony, who will be giving a presentation followed by a Q&A.
Hey, thank you so much, Philip. Let me just hit screen share for this moment and make sure it always works. So can you see that on your big screen? Great.
Perfect.
Hello, everyone. I wish I was there. It's good to be here. Thank you for all introducing yourselves. I'll speak to about around 2 o'clock, Philip. That well, my time is 8 o'clock your time.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So good to be here, and I hope you're all well. And I was telling Philip before, forgive me if I'm speaking a bit soft. I work in New York City, and I was in my office, home office, and on some Zoom calls, and my daughter's taking a very big test, and I was sent to the kitchen because I'm farther away from her bedroom where she said I was talking too loud. So here I am live from the kitchen. I hope you're all well. It's been an extraordinary year. Philip and I were talking briefly before, as soon as we met, that in so many ways, this year has really pulled the curtain back on the existential dimension of life and all our lives, and death and dying and suffering, and it really pulled the curtain back and revealed all this up front, which we know is always there. But I've been studying death and dying for much of my life, and humans are pretty good at pushing it back, keeping it at bay. This, as Ernest Becker would say, the denial of death. And this past year really, I think, highlighted this for all of us. And it dovetails, of course, with this talk that I want to give tonight about psilocybin in terms of our research, but the broader topic of psychedelics and relieving end-of-life distress that so many people go through. By way of quick background, I've been working in palliative care for a long time. I founded a palliative care service at Bellevue Hospital in New York, which is part of NYU Medical Center. For 25 years, I've been at NYU, a professor there, and ran a palliative care clinic and also a pain center. And I'm a psychologist, and I work in the Department of Psychiatry. And as many of you may know, we began doing research with psilocybin back in 2008, 2009. And in 2016, we published a paper along with Johns Hopkins together, looking at the efficacy and safety of one psilocybin-induced session with people with advanced cancer and struggling with existential and psychospiritual, issues. And I'll go through that data a bit today with you as well. And that was really it was a big moment for the field. In terms of palliative care and hospice. I'm glad to hear about the Buddhist mention as well tonight. I have strong interest in, the perennial philosophy, the kind of the mystical core of human consciousness. And I won't go into the neuroscience too much today or at all. So hopefully I won't disappoint in that way. My interests have been really in the phenomenology of this experience, these incredible opportunities we have to explore human consciousness with the psychedelic, and how they've been shown to be incredibly impactful and helpful in relieving, among many things, in this case, the distress that can come as our bodies begin to fail and as we're beginning to die. I do want to just put a highlight because it's important, and I'll get to it also in the talk as well. But it's important to know as the field grows rapidly. I mean, it's just been incredible, the changes over the past year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. When we began in 2008, it was kind of, we had a whisper. Although we were approved to do the research, it was kind of hush-hush behind closed doors. And now it's everywhere. I just got a text as I was speaking about 10 minutes ago that California the Senate just approved a bill for the legalization of psychedelics. We'll see where that goes. So in this incredibly rapidly changing landscape of psychedelics, I hope I always remember to point out where we came from. It behooves us to know where we came from as we move forward. And by that I mean it in two ways. One is the incredible researchers of the first wave Without Walter Pahnke and Bill Richards and Stan Grof and the incredible work with cancer patients in the 1960s, we wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be here today for sure. Um, there was only two indications to come out of the first wave of research back in the States. One was for alcoholism, and the other was for advanced cancer. And there was also a small spirituality inquiry we'll talk about. And for me, I mean, my friend, Ralph Metzner, who I got to know later in life, who passed away, and one of the pioneers, he always said to the very day he passed, sadly 2 years ago, that he felt the most important indication was psychedelics for the end of life, to really ease and transform our anxiety about death itself. And I believe, I agree with that. It's been profoundly um, heartfelt to watch these changes in our patients. And I'll talk today a bit more later also about where we're going from here in terms of next research. So with that, let's start. What else can I say about the background? That's kind of it for now. But I, really, and the other thing that I think it behooves us to remember is the experiences themselves. They've been profiled and chronicled throughout human history, through indigenous culture, through antiquity. In my perspective, these aren't about the drugs per se. It's about the drugs generating this incredible opportunity for mystical or peak or spiritual experience that we see to be transformative. And one of the key findings to come out of the Johns Hopkins and NYU studies is that this mystical or peak experience that I'll define for you in a few minutes has been correlated with the more positive clinical outcomes. And that part just fascinates me. What is it about our human consciousness and our capacity for these incredible mystical or peak or numinous experiences, as Carl Jung called them, that allow for a tremendous transformation of suffering? And it leads me to think that we're wired for meaning, that humans are wired for incredible states of personal meaning that come naturally. And we see that throughout history, throughout the religions, and they also are reliably generated with these medicines. And that's been my focus in the past, presently, and going forward as well. So with that, we will begin. So I'll talk a bit about the palliative care in general. For those who don't know, I'm glad there are some people here in psycho-oncology, which is just really an important part of these medicines. We'll talk about meaning and transcendence, two really important dimensions. I'll give a brief history of psychedelics and psilocybin, which you already know. We'll really talk about this mystical or peak experience that our research has been shown to be correlated with the more positive outcomes. That's really very interesting. And that goes back to the 1960s. I'll review the research from the first wave and, of course, our recent research and our NYU trial and implications for the future with palliative care and hospice. In America now, there's a lot of conversation about all of this, as you all know. States are decriminalizing things. We're pushing forward with FDA clinical trials. My hope is that within 5 years or so, that psilocybin would be rescheduled for use in end-of-life suffering, which is really promising given the paucity of tools we have to help people emotionally. We've gotten better at chemotherapies and pain management in our fields, but we still have a hard time helping people find meaning and mitigate some of the emotional distress at the end of life. So I'll move this part quickly so I can get to the psychedelic piece, but I do want to give a background how most people don't die well in America and other parts of the world. Most people would prefer to die at home surrounded by family, as we say in palliative care, to die well or a good death. Is a strange combination of words, I know. But so many people die in ICUs. So many people die with extra attempts to extend life by a few weeks or months, but the quality of life is so diminished. So often I've had conversation with oncologists and surgeons discussing this, and it's finally getting more okay to talk about it. But for so long, it really was a taboo. Quality of life versus extending it for a little bit through heroic efforts, but where the quality is not helped. And this just underscores that. I mean, I recently put the dates into these op-eds. I cut this out so many years ago, and it's a bit unfortunate that, 2006 and we're still having a hard time with these conversations. But I will say that medical schools are getting better at it. When I first began, there was no courses in death and dying. There were no courses in how to speak to a person at the end of life, and that's changing. And I look forward to hearing how it's changing up by you as well. In 1997, the Institute of Medicine really made a mandate to improve how we die in America. And sadly, a recent study showed that depression in the final year of life is increasing, even with the advances. And I do want to point out the advances. Things have gotten better. The palliative care community, the hospice community, the end of life community in America, and I know around the world, is really advancing with end of life doulas and best-selling books and death over dinner and all these different conversations. So death and dying are becoming more talked about, but we still have a long way to go. And importantly, depression and hopelessness are strong predictors for a desire for a hastened death, end of life patients. And I'm going to show you how some of our data that we mitigated this through one psilocybin experience. And this is an important construct that you'll be hearing more about, demoralization syndrome. The core findings are that hopelessness, meaninglessness, existential distress are the core phenomena. This is emerging as a really important construct in palliative care and in hospice. And our research was able to decrease demoralization dramatically after the one session. And now we're launching a new multi-site study where we're going to look at demoralization in palliative care. And other centers are as well. There are centers launching studies at Emory, up at Harvard and Boston, at NYU, UCSF, UCLA. And we're all looking at this important construct of demoralization that isn't always correlated with depression. So some people at the end of life will endorse symptoms of depression, but not have demoralization. Others have demoralization, but not depression. So they seem to be overlapping, but clinically divergent constructs. The promising part is that demoralization responds better to meaning-making psychotherapies and less so to conventional antidepressants. So that really leaves an opening for us and our community to provide these meaning-making experiences to people who are suffering a loss of meaning. And as many of you may know or should know or will know now, palliative care affirms life and death as normal processes. It doesn't hasten or postpone death. It integrates the psycho-spiritual part of our lives. And it really looks at cultivating meaning and purpose, because research shows that those are the most helpful constructs for end-of-life distress. And I'm going to just jump through all this, but just trust me that there's a large mountain of literature showing that people at the end of life suffer, and there's a lot of unmet needs within our healthcare system to help find hope, to find meaning, to cultivate a sense of purpose. And importantly, depression and hopelessness are key contributors to a desire for a hastened death. But if people are not depressed or hopeless, that desire for a hastened death disappears at the end of life. And that's crucial. One of the studies I'd love to do, a dream study, would be up in Canada and also in Oregon and the West Coast in America. There are physician-assisted suicide models. And I feel mixed about those. And we could talk about that in the conversation later. Because they're easy to get on those lists. And research has shown the key criteria is having existential distress. I would love to do, and other people have agreed, to get hold of that list and invite people on that list to have a psilocybin-generated experience and to see if that changed, if they no longer had a desire for a hastened death. I think we need to do better at improving life and not quickly resorting to assisted suicide. But we could talk about that because it's a complicated legal and conceptual conversation. And briefly, this is a study not done about psychedelics, but it really, for me, forms the rationale for our research. Studies show
Sorry to jump in, Tony. I
Yeah.
think maybe the slides have stopped changing.
Uh-oh.
Because it's still showing Institute of Medicine, 1997.
Uh-oh. Okay, let's go back. I don't know why that is. Do you see that?
No, it's frozen.
So what
maybe
you
you wanna.
Maybe come out of screen share and go back in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we stop screen share. Okay, now let me try to go back in. Do you see that?
It's the same slide.
Okay, let me advance it. Do you see that? Is it moving?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna go through the things you missed. You missed that demoralization syndrome I was talking about. Palliative care. Are you seeing this, Philip?
Yes.
Great. These are the unmet needs I was discussing. Finding meaning. This is important. If people are not depressed or helpless, they decrease their desire for a hiss of death. And here's where I was. So studies show over and over meaning and transcendence. And for me, this is the heart of the work. Um, Help people at the end of life mitigate end of life suffering. And to me, meaning making and transcendence, that incredible experience of transcending our body, time and space as we know it, and we'll talk about that in detail, is the heart of the psychedelic generated experience. Um, and the psycho-oncology and palliative care community, this is from Sloan Kettering, show that those two domains have been the most helpful in people reducing stress. So I think it allows an invitation for us to enter the field. And as we speak, actually, we're Steve Ross and I are contributing a chapter to the next palliative care handbook that Bill Breitbart and Harry Chachanov, two of the palliative care leaders, are publishing. So I'm heartened that this work has entered into the palliative care conversation in America. Is that working, Philip? Thumbs up? Great. Okay. If you think this freezes, let me know. So Viktor Frankl, who I'm sure many of you know, all of you know, was a Holocaust survivor who went on to develop logotherapy, a psychotherapy about meaning. And he has so many wonderful quotes. And one of them was, meaning can be found in life literally up to the last moment, the last breath, even in the face of death. And again, there's an abundance of literature showing meaning making and spiritual being are buffers against demoralization and hopelessness. And again, a great quote by Frankl: man isn't destroyed by suffering, he's destroyed by suffering without meaning. And I recommend, for those who haven't read it, his book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is about his years in the Holocaust and his whole thinking about how meaning making is such an incredible part of the human experience. I want to read you one thing and then get on to the research. This is an important paper. Now it's already 40 years old or so. Eric Cassell is a leading thinker in medicine. And he wrote this article in the New England Journal many years ago. It became a book. It was so popularly received. And it was about transcendence in healthcare. And I want to read just part of it. And I recommend getting the paper because it's an important paper. He wrote, transcendence is the most powerful way in which one is restored to wholeness. Everyone has a transcendent dimension, a life of the spirit. This is most directly expressed in religion and the mystic traditions. When experienced, this is not about psychedelics, but it was just about general healthcare. Transcendence locates the person in a far larger landscape. Such an experience need not involve religion in a formal sense. However, in its transpersonal dimension, it is deeply spiritual. The quality of being greater and more lasting than an individual life gives this aspect of the person its timeless dimension. And we're going to come back to this timeless dimension again today. The profession of medicine appears to ignore the human spirit. When I see patients in nursing homes who have become only bodies, I wonder, is it not their transcendent dimension that they have lost? And I think this is the heart of the matter for us. I'm going to show you our data in a second and talk about some patients. But this has been the most touching part, that people tell us, I had insights that I'm not just my body. I'm something more enduring. Something more was cultivated for me. And that's an incredible gift. And I want to get into that in a moment. And again, Cicely Saunders, who, not again, first time I'm talking about her, she was the co-founder of hospice. And she wrote, you can find wholeness as a person, whether you get better or not, whether you suffer or not. And I've seen people find wholeness as they die. And that's the miracle of palliative care and hospice, that we need not have physical healing to be healed, to become whole again. Becoming whole again doesn't involve the body becoming whole again, because the body is failing and will soon cease working. It's about a psychological wholeness, a spiritual wholeness, and we see that in these end of life sessions with these patients. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. These are some of the organizations who've really called out for novel research to address end of life distress, and I believe our psychedelic work has answered that call. Everything's moving okay, Philip? Thumbs up? Okay, great. So let's turn to the research. We're using psilocybin. This group knows what psilocybin is. I won't spend too much time on it. It occurs naturally in mushrooms for the newcomers here. Been used for millennia by indigenous cultures for visionary healing, for spiritual purposes, for ritual, not for recreation. The Aztecs called it the flesh of the gods. It involves serotonergic pathways and mainly around 5-HT2A receptors in the brain. If you block those, as we know, it mutes the experience. So those are the key clinical neurotransmitter receptor sites. And there's other, findings coming out of the neuroscience world regarding psychedelics, default mode network, and neuroplasticity. But today I'm going to discuss mainly the experience itself and less of the neuroscience. But importantly, psychedelics do not trigger the same brain systems that trigger addiction, and they don't lead to addiction. Johns Hopkins is doing wonderful, large survey research with enormous questionnaires for thousands, tens of thousands of people. There's no evidence of association between lifetime use and increase in mental disorders or suicidal thinking. So they seem to be safe over the long run as well, and very different from most other drugs. And again, we see them used going back 1000 BC in the Mayan culture. We also, we think the psychedelics were used in the famous Eleusinian mysteries in Eleusis, Greek. I was telling Philip earlier, I'm a proud Greek American, and I've been to Eleusis, and I've been very interested in the Eleusinian mysteries that spanned 2,000 years in ancient Greece, and people like Plato and Cicero from Rome, we believe, came to these mystery schools and drank a kykeon, a liquid we believe to be an ergot alkaloid that Carl Ruck and Gordon Wasson and Albert Hofmann wrote about back in the 70s. So we see these medicines being used, and in terms of Eleusis, we believe, and there are some writings, that it was about glimpsing the afterlife, about glimpsing this sense of timelessness or immortality. And we see it throughout different cultures. That's the site of Eleusis. I was there a number of years ago. That's the chief archaeologist. It's about 13 miles from Athens. You could go there. It's a state facility now. And I was telling Philip, I'll update him in a year or two, and you can all get his list there. The European Union has made Eleusis the cultural capital of Europe for 2023. And we hope to do some symposia there. So I will, you'll be the first to hear about it. We see it in the Rig Veda, other cultures, that soma, that a drug we think similar to, it was the mushrooms in this case, but allowed for these incredible insights. And to fast forward 2,000 years, in Life magazine, the big magazine in America in the 1950s, there was an article by Gordon Wasson, who went to Mexico, met Maria Sabina, who you see in the picture, and participated in a psilocybin mushroom ceremony. Until then, there was no awareness of psilocybin mushrooms in America or in the West outside of these indigenous cultures. He wrote this article. It got a lot of attention by people like Tim Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Ram Dass, who was then Richard Alpert. Albert Hofmann in Switzerland began to synthesize psilocybin from the mushrooms and quickly began the research in the field. I want to walk through what's important part of today's talk is this mystical experience. So after Hofmann synthesized psilocybin, research began in the 1950s with alcoholism in Canada. Humphrey Osmond, who did great work up there, And many people know, and some don't know, that Alcoholics Anonymous was really founded in many ways on Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, on his LSD psychedelic experiences. And that forms some of the foundation for the idea that this spiritual experience can serve as an ablation to want to drink alcohol to achieve that state, as Jung would say. But it was part of our essence. And so then the two key indicators were out of the 60s was alcoholism and cancer distress. And one of the, I think, watershed moments of the early era at Spring Grove in Maryland with Stan Groff and others was this mystical experience questionnaire, the MEQ, that we still use today, over a half a century later. And Johns Hopkins has validated it and updated it. And it still shows when these few criteria, 6 or so criteria, are endorsed, the more this is endorsed by the patient, the greater the clinical outcome. And it really is remarkable. And it's been sustained over a number of studies: end of life distress, cigarette smoking, and all our studies have this questionnaire being used. So what are these qualities? One is the sense of unity, the sense of all things being connected, all people and things, all as one. The noetic quality, a term coined by William James, that the person experiencing this ultimate reality, and people never tell me after a session, or rarely tell us, or never tell us, that was a temporary drug effect. The language they use is more like this noetic quality. That was part of ultimate reality. That was an important part of who we are, not just a temporary drug effect. A sense of sacredness, awe, humility, holiness, deeply felt positive moods, and very difficult stretches. This isn't all easy, especially for a patient who is dying. But we found through our working model that even very difficult stretches, by encountering death itself, could result in a transformative insight, that I'll talk about. Ineffability, impossible to describe in words, although they do a good job. And again, transcendence, transcending time, space. If the body's beginning to fail, and you know that in a matter of weeks, months, or a year, this body will cease to be working, of course, the anxiety is that I stop working as well. And maybe it is the end. But the insight people tell us, that we see throughout the research, is that people express something more enduring about what the self is. That I'm more than this body. I'm more than this cancer. Something more enduring about self, consciousness. And of course, it gets a bit metaphysical and ontological, but people tell us, is consciousness something more complicated than brain-generated function, but somehow even outside biology? So we get into a very kind of spiritual, transcendent language in the research, especially with people who are dying. And again, this is not about the psychedelics, but this concept of the peak experience, of the mystical experience, is known throughout ages. And of course, the last century, great book, William James. This is a great book. I recommend Richard Buck, Cosmic Consciousness, an incredible book that actually influenced William James on the naturally occurring peak experiences that humans can have. Rudolf Otto, Carl Jung, and the great American psychologist Abraham Maslow wrote that the mystical peak experience is the same in their essence of all religions. And this is the core part of consciousness, what he called the core transcendent experience. And Albert Einstein, who I think was a modern mystic, said the most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical. So let's get to the, I'm going to run through this the service of time. This is quickly the 1962 study giving healthy theology students psilocybin in Marsh Chapel in Boston. And majority had a very profound mystical experience, mirroring naturally occurring experiences. And in 2006, Johns Hopkins replicated that, showing 1 dose of psilocybin can generate this mystical experience that we see happen naturally throughout time. That's the room where it took place. I was there just with some colleagues right before COVID hit in January of 2020. And that's where the study took place. We took a visit there during the seminar. That's a few of us who were there: Charlie Grob, Robin Curran-Harris, one of the members of the study, Mary Casamano, the great guide from Hopkins, and Manish Agarwal, who's over at doing psilocybin work with cancer patients at in Maryland. It's important to point out these experiences happen naturally and with the medicine, but I want to point that out. There's been studies comparing the two, and they look identical, and it's important to say. Let me get to the research. And the great Aldous Huxley. This is the research on the on the top part of the screen. Are the key studies out of the 1960s showing one dose of LSD primarily could generate this mystical experience and mitigate end-of-life distress in cancer patients. The bottom half of the psilocybin trials in America, UCLA, Johns Hopkins, and our team at NYU, showing also one dose of psilocybin in this theoretical model that I'll talk about could produce the dramatic reduction in anxiety, depression, demoralization, hopelessness, and I'll go through the studies in a moment. And in Switzerland, there was an LSD trial as well that showed promising results as well, but not using psilocybin. So our trial at NYU looked at, along with Johns Hopkins, but our trial had a cohort with cancer, about 2/3, or actually a little more, about 2/3, 65% or so, was stage 3 or 4 cancer. Very few people were in remission, 1 or 2, but the key criteria for inclusion was a very significant emotional DSM-4, now DSM-5, diagnosis, distress secondary to the cancer. We had one dose, one session only, embedded within a brief, supportive, and integrative psychotherapeutic period. These are some quotes from people in our study. Some of these people have since passed away. This changed my life, referring to the study itself. I can't imagine it. Fear of cancer, from a person who has cancer. I felt the constant state of becoming, totally welcome. Death doesn't matter from a person who's within a year of dying. I mean, think about the impact of these words, where death becomes so changed. I'm less afraid of death. Death is part of life. This is the one person who was in remission and was crippled with fear of recurrence, and now she was not. The sense of the eternal moment, the sense of transcendence. And we'll talk about love in a little while. As the years go on, I'm speaking more and more about love with some colleagues of mine, because that's what people are telling us. When we ask patients, what was the key factor? What changed? What changed from this experience? And they'll talk about this incredible sense of love, loving kindness towards self, towards others, and of a greater kind of, almost like a cosmic love. And we'll get into that also. That's our wonderful team. These are some of the measures we used. The key measures were variables were anxiety and depression, but we looked at so many items, transcendence and meaning and forgiveness and purpose in life, various demoralization. So as many of you know, there's 3 key phases to the research. The preparatory phase is meeting with after they're consented and screened for medical and psychiatric exclusionary criteria. They're admitted to the study for 2 or 4 weeks. Usually a male and a female dyad team meet with them and preparing them as best we can for the experience. We can't predict what will happen, but we can prepare them for how to go into the altered state, and that's through. They wear eye shades and headphones for the session, if they can keep them on, and everyone does, playing a prepared soundtrack of music. And that is all to distract from consensus reality and encourage direction towards their interior, going into the unfolding changes in consciousness that this drug induces within an hour, these dramatically altered states of awareness. We get to know them very well in these 4 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, reviewing their life, how cancer has affected them, their thoughts about death, family issues, prior traumas. So we get a good sense of who they are. And we ask them to trust the medicine, trust the guides, trust consciousness. And one of the most important features of this preparation period, and this was all set by the 1960s. We really used the model developed by Stan Grof and others 50 years ago, is a sense of trust and rapport in us, the guides, and being there, trusting the room. In the hundreds of cases we've had now in the States, there are no serious adverse effects. There are tough stretches during the experience, but people leave that night, no one's left that night after the experience with a serious adverse emotional side effect. And we can't say that for the culture at large. People will take these medicines in recreational states who aren't screened and don't have the proper container. And that's really important about this experience. Setting, the mindset, how it's done, the intention, trust, let go, be open is kind of a mantra for the experience. Then there's the medication session where they lie all day on a couch. I think I have a picture to show you of the room. There are two of us the entire day reassuring them should they need help. They can always sit up and talk if they have to. We check in periodically. But for the most part, if it goes well, the medication session is very little talking as they're going into the unfolding changes. And we recommend they go into the session itself and to go towards whatever's coming up, even suffering, even death, and see what it has to teach you. And in its own, consciousness is kind of directing this person into the experience where they're cultivating insight and a host of experiences that we'll talk about today. Then there's follow-up integration, supportive integration sessions. That's the room. You see that this is actually the day of a session before the patient came in. So it's a nice room. It's in a hospital, but it's like a living room-like setting. And this is where the preparation takes place. Then the couch becomes the bed for the day, and we sit right on the side of on the floor on the side of the bed, and they have the medicine at 9 a.m. And for about 6 to 8 hours, they're in this psilocybin-generated altered state. But 5 p.m. they're back in ordinary consciousness. They go home, and then there's follow-up sessions. Briefly, there's those 2 to 4 weeks of prep sessions I spoke about. In our study, there was a dose of psilocybin or placebo, which was nice. And then there's a 7-week period before the crossover. Each patient serves as their own control. And that's where all our data was collected to compare psilocybin versus placebo. Then there's a second dosing session, which is the one they didn't get the first time, the psilocybin and niacin. There's follow-up integration and ongoing support. At 6.5 months, and then at 8 months, we collected all the data that I'll show you in the next slide. And then we looked at these people, the ones who are living still, and many had died, 4.5 years later. And I want to show you some of the findings from that study that we just published last year. So on some of the anxiety and depression scales, we see this red line, vertical line you see, where it says drug administration. Philip, all good? See the slide? Great. The pink being the psilocybin cohort and the blue being the niacin, the placebo. This is before crossover. So if I extend the graph, and I may show you a graph with that, the top bar, the blue bar, would then get the psilocybin, and then their bar actually merges, and they're the same because both cohorts got the psilocybin. But before the crossover, we can compare the two, and we see this dramatic drop in anxiety and depression the day after the session. The effect sizes are in the white numbers on top, as many of you may know. Those are very, very large. Those are effect sizes we don't see in psychotherapy research, psychiatry research. Johns Hopkins had the same numbers. They're really dramatically significant. This is the HADS anxiety scale. Again, we see this drop in psilocybin, significant through those effect sizes. Another depression scale, again, the day after the session, they drop. The Beck Depression Inventory, again. So we did a battery of depression and anxiety scales, and everyone, along with Johns Hopkins, with these consistent drops the day after the session. And then you see, this is a 26-week graph. If you can see the green vertical lines, after the second dosing, the top bar begins to drop, and eventually it meets the cohort. So we see everyone who gets the psilocybin eventually has the same reduction in suffering. But the key finding was before the crossover to compare the two. This is extraordinary, folks. So in palliative care, we have very little success in reducing hopelessness and demoralization. And these are the two key constructs that are affiliated with desire for a hastened death. And here you see the drop, the psilocybin is pink and blue is placebo. After the first session, you see this dramatic drop in these two domains, which was extraordinary, and got the attention of the palliative care community, because we really can't achieve this too frequently in just psychotherapy or with antidepressants. And I should mention quickly before I forget, this is a completely different model of relieving suffering. Antidepressants you take every day to hopefully quiet down some of the symptomatology in terms of the person's experience. This is a paradigm shift. This medicine session is taken once, not every day, of course. And it's inviting the person to move into the suffering, to move into it, and through that to learn about the underpinnings of it and these deeper existential issues, where it's transformed and changed. Not just a symptom quieted down, but the underlying experience has changed. People reported death transcendence, defined as connecting with something more enduring than oneself or death itself. Almost 90% reported improvement in quality of life. Over half reported being the most important spiritual and meaning-making experience of their lifetime. This is the Hopkins data. Just quickly, it's the same data, but to just show you one chart. Again, after the first session, this dramatic drop in anxiety and depression. Their study was a little different. Their study looked at high-dose psilocybin, and these are all high doses. So to be clear, our research purposely gives a high dose to generate this peak experience. Their study used high dose compared to a very low dose, but we saw the same results. This is interesting. This is a study done last year. We contacted the surviving members of the group who still had, well, one or two were in remission and they still were healthy. And others were still sick with cancer, but were living now 4 years. And again, we see this continuation, the sustained decrease in anxiety, depression, demoralization, hopelessness, these important things of personally meaningful, spiritually meaningful experiences. This was published last month. We looked at another sample from our study, looking at loss of meaning. And again, we see, you see in these graphs here before the crossover that the psilocybin group has a reduction in loss of meaning greater than the placebo group. So in conclusion, these studies show that there were no serious adverse effects. There was some mild elevation of blood pressure and headaches and nausea that dissipated after the first hour. Feasibility was established, of course. Up to 80% of the participants in both Hopkins and NYU show these significant results at the end of the study 8 months later, and many at the 4.5-year marker. This is important. Both sites show that the mystical experience was a mediating factor in those results. There were other experiences too that we'll talk about in our conversation, other than this mystical or peak experience, such as a kind of a psychodynamically autobiographical review of one's life that can be very, very profound as well, reliving interpersonal conflicts, unresolved conflicts, and resolving a lot of, the mess that becomes the human life for all of us in so many ways. Demoralization, hopelessness. These are the two papers. It was kind of a big media thing that took us by surprise. And I wanted to read to you a few quotes from some patients before we go to conversation. First, a few brief quotes to give you a flavor of the language we hear so often. These quotes are from people in the 4.5-year follow-up. So many people had died. Over 2/3 have passed away in our trial. A little more than that. But for the survivors, we asked them to reflect on how it changed them. And here are some of the language that we hear so often. So everybody's asked to write a journal. And the journals are so poignant. We've published 2 qualitative papers as well with these qualitative excerpts, and they're just very touching. So one person wrote, "It has given me a different perspective on my life and has helped me to move on with my life and not focus on the cancer. I try not to hold on to stress or unimportant things." Another person wrote, "It's hard to explain, but something in me softened. I realized that everyone is just trying to do the best they can, even me, and that matters because we're all connected." Another person wrote, "There was a reckoning that came with my cancer, and this reckoning was enhanced by the psilocybin experience. I have a greater appreciation and sense of gratitude for being alive." Now, many people have this sense of consciousness somehow persisting or enduring after death, and some don't. But all of them have this great appreciation for the moment they're living in now. And we hear that over and over. Even with pending death, there's a greater gratitude, which is, again, we're scientists doing this research and we're hearing language like the poetry of spirituality. These experiences are just recalibrating how they live. Once the thought that cancer is part of your life, you realize that this or something similar awaits others who are unsuspecting. This compels you to relate to others from the perspective of compassion due to the changeable and temporary nature of our existence. Radical change is just around the corner. We are children in our understanding of life until something reaches deep into your heart and announces itself. I understand the life process to be one of realization of our divine nature. This does not mean some supernatural creature. It is a process of remembrance. The experience reinforced my understanding that we are all very much together, and the prevailing feeling in the end is love. This gentleman you're looking at here on your screen is Patrick Metes, who passed away about a year after his study. I had the honor and privilege of working with him and being his session guide. You may recognize his name when Michael Pollan began to write his book and his articles on the subject. He had asked me for some patients who were, their story was very impactful. And I mentioned Patrick. Patrick had passed away already, but his wife Lisa had allowed Michael and us to use Patrick's words to underscore the experience. Patrick had an awful cancer of the bile duct. He really suffered. This is a picture of him a week before his death. He was in such an incredible space. He didn't want to die and leave his lovely wife, but he wasn't afraid anymore. And he wrote this beautiful, 7-page journal entry. I'm not going to read you all of it. I'll read just two quick paragraphs. He wrote that from here on, and he had an incredible session that actually included a kind of an ego death rebirth process that I won't detail, but it was extraordinary. And I'm indebted to Patrick for being a teacher to us. He wrote about his experience. From here on, love was the only consideration. Everything that happened, everything that was seen or heard centered on love. It was and is the only purpose. The sheer joy was indescribable. And then he goes on to say how nothing in his life has come close to this feeling. And he had an incredible good life. He was a journalist. He owned restaurants. He also took a tour of his lungs. He said he could see his lungs. He could see the tumors. And he wrote, I took a tour of my lungs. There were nodules there, but they seemed unimportant. I was being told, not verbally, but informed, to not worry about the cancer. It's minor in the scheme of things. The work to be done is before you. Love. And he says, my life has changed in ways I may never fully comprehend, but I now have an understanding, that awareness that goes beyond intellect, that my life, every life, all that is the universe equals one thing, love. And we hear this language over and over and over. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Zen monk, writes, our true nature is the nature of no birth and no death. When we touch our true nature, can we transcend the fear of non-being, the fear of annihilation? There's a great monastery in speaking of Greece, in Greece, Mount Athos. I was lucky enough to go there many years ago. Above one of the doors of the monasteries, there's an inscription going back 1,000 years or more. If you die before you die, then you won't die when you die. And clearly that's relating to this experience of this sense of transcending death, this sense of having this death experience while we live as preparation. And I don't think the monks at the monastery 1,000 years ago were using psychedelics, but they also occur naturally. And we see these insights in the mystical core of the great religions. And I'm very interested in near-death experiences, and we're doing some work now at NYU with this, hopefully. And these are people who are pronounced dead, no cardiac function on the operating table or in some other manner. And they recall their experiences. And Kenneth Ring, one of the big researchers, says that, again, the most common experience was this of love. And so I think, there's no way of knowing, but it feels like the near-death experience and the mystical experience through medicine or naturally, these kind of occupy a similar landscape and consciousness. And it behooves us to learn more about these experiences. I'm going to run through this to finish up. Carl Jung, always spoke about the mystery being so important in our life. And that nothing's holy because we've lost the sense of the numinosity. And in closing up, there's a well-known experience of a mystical experience by a NASA astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, in 1971, who, from what I understand, was not using LSD on the spaceship that day on the way back from the moon, but he had a naturally occurring mystical experience that he spoke about. And when he came back to Earth, he devoted his life to study these experiences. Kyle, they're out by you, the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, he helped co-found. And by the way, a lot of astronauts have these experiences. They're called the overview effect. You can Google that, where astronauts in the space station or those who have walked on the moon go for spacewalks. When they just see this large, incredible view, it triggers these naturally peak experiences. And Edgar Mitchell wrote on the way back from the moon, he was looking at his cockpit window, and he saw the Earth, the moon, and he suddenly had this incredible peak experience. And he had the experience, the insight that the molecules of his body, of his astronauts, of the spacecraft were all one. That we're all one. We're all connected. And that went on to be his, the major of his life. So I put this here because people often will say to me, "You always quote these spiritual people," and well, I'm quoting scientists as well, because the experience isn't spiritual or secular. It's just an experience, but can be described in a variety of ways. It turns out that over the millennia, religious mystics have described it very well, but anyone can, poets can. And finally, the implications, of course, of palliative care, prove how we die, better understand the neuroscience, the neurobiology of these experiences, social and ethical implications, of course, for other cohorts, addiction, PTSD, depression, for interreligious dialogue. I'm finishing a study now giving psilocybin to religious leaders from all traditions to understand their experience and how it could advance, hopefully, our interreligious, interfaith relationships. Palliative care, and importantly, I'm very curious how these medicines can be used to understand human consciousness. What is consciousness, big C, and what is human consciousness? And it's a big question. Is it generated by complex brain function? Is it more complicated than that? And it seems to me it's the final frontier of science. And finally, in closing, I want to just give a tribute to Albert Hofmann with the Blue Jacket, who discovered LSD in 1938. And Gordon Wasson, who brought back mushrooms in 1957, and to close with a quote by Albert Hofmann. Alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of a materialistic era. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this. They are tools which are guiding our perception toward other deeper areas of human existence, so that we again become aware of our spiritual essence. Psychedelics in a safe setting can help our consciousness open up to the sensation of connection and being one with nature. It is my great concern to separate psychedelics from the ongoing debates about drugs and to highlight the tremendous potential inherent to these substances for self-awareness, for therapy, and for research into the human mind. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you, Tony. That was beautiful. It's a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you.
And we have about 25 minutes left for questions. And I want to invite you all to use the raise hand function under participants. And I will give you the word. If you want to, you can also write your question in the chat if you prefer it to be read. But I think it's more fun and intimate if we actually talk to each other, so to speak. So yeah, we'll use the gallery view. Feel free to also wave if you want the word. I want to start by asking a question, though. Take the privilege being the host. I'm really curious about the non-responders in that you sat with, or that others sat with in the NYU cancer trial. Could you share a little bit about why some people did not have a mystical experience, and what was your impression of them?
Yeah, So let me be clear on that. We had no non-responders, meaning no one had, one person had kind of a muted experience, but there were no people who had no experience. Um, when I mentioned that before, I hope I was clear, that not everyone had the mystical experience. About 2/3 consistently have, about 67% had this mystical peak experience. But the other experiences that people have, like that psychodynamic life review experience, are profoundly therapeutic. Um, some of those scales may not have hit the same threshold as the mystical experience scale, but the idea of reliving interpersonal trauma, resolving unresolved emotional conflicts, those are therapeutic. But yes, not people, they didn't endorse that peak level. And I'll discuss actually a good case that underscores this. Um, as to why people have mystical and peak and others don't, and we don't know. Obviously, we have some theories. I do. I think preparation matters. The trust and rapport matters. Someone's mindset, someone's attachment history, their trauma history, their sense of defendedness may play into matter, may play into the experience. But again, there are various levels of the experience, not just one peak experience. And it reminds me of one case quickly, that there was a gentleman I worked with who had stage 4 lung cancer. He's passed away. Lovely guy, and he was from Eastern Europe, and he was an older gentleman, and a lot of his family had been killed in the Holocaust, and he didn't endorse this mystical peak level that 2/3 of the people had. Um, and I'm convinced if he had a second session, psilocybin session, he would have had that kind of experience. But he had a very difficult but therapeutic experience where he was revisiting and working through all those traumas of the memories of his family. And to give you one little vignette, during this session, he began to speak in German. I don't speak German, and I leaned over. He lives in New York. He was an American, of course. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're saying. And then he said in English, can I have a glass of water, a cup of water? And I went to the bathroom and I gave him a cup of water and lifted him up, headphones just low on the eye shades, and we put him back down, and he went back into the experience. And there's very little talking during the day typically. That night or the next morning, I had asked him, you asked for a cup of water in German at some point. What was that about? Do you recall? And he said, and it's very moving. I often get tearful talking about it. He said he had kind of entered the space where he was told, and all these stories of his cousins who were sent on the trains to the Holocaust, to the camps, and who were killed. And he remembers being told that the elders would tell the children, teach them how to ask for a cup of water in German. And he had embodied his cousin asking for that. I mean, there was this kind of empathic alignment with the suffering of that time. And so much of his experience was this working through so much pent-up trauma that really released him. And his depression scores were good. And as the months went on afterwards, he would call us, and he felt more and more open and more present in his life. So often there's so much interpersonal life story to be moved through that becomes the heart of it. But this transcendent experience does seem to trigger the most profound results. And as to why that is, I think as we do more studies over the years, we'll get a better sense of who's having what kind of trial experience.
Thank you. I will pass the word to Einar.
Yes, I have a political question. Who do you think should have the right to assisted suicide?
Well, will you hear what I mentioned before? Were you here for the part when I talked about that before?
Yeah, that you wish you could give them mushrooms.
Yeah. So you were there. Yeah, good. I don't have an easy answer for that. So in America, there are some states that have these models, and Canada does. A good friend of mine, Ira Bayak, who's a leading spokesperson for palliative care in America, always says doctors weren't trained to kill. Obviously, it's complicated. I think it behooves us as clinicians to compassionately relieve suffering as best we can. And it's my understanding and my insight and my experience that there are people who want to have assisted suicide who could probably benefit without, could relieve suffering without that. To the larger question, who could do that? It's beyond my scope. Clearly, I think they're complicated issues. I just yeah, I would like to do a trial, and I think we will at some point, where people who were on that list for assisted suicide, but then had the experience and maybe changed their mind. There are clearly some very, very, very difficult medical conditions that I've worked with, Lou Gehrig's, and these conditions where you're locked into your body where the suffering is just paramount. And I have no right, nor does anyone, to judge someone's intention and how to live their life. But I do hope that we can dedicate ourselves to relief of suffering before delegated to that kind of intervention. I know it's a non-answer, but I think it's a complicated question, and I try to compassionately respect all the voices in the field, and hopefully there's a result that is somehow okay for other people, but it's complicated and very, very hotly debated, as you know.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is I'm one of those people who put text on the internet, and I'm gonna write an exploratory text on assisted suicide.
What are your thoughts?
My thoughts? I have not made up my mind yet. I think the Swiss are onto something.
Yeah, it's complicated too. Look, we get sworn in to do no harm. We do our job to compassionately relieve suffering in whatever form that means. And I'm not a physician, so I'm grateful don't have to participate in those acts. But a lot of people in palliative care wish we could do more to relieve suffering. But it's very complicated, and there's a lot of suffering at the end of life.
Quick follow-up question. Oh, you go, Einar.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask, what's the dose that you gave in the study?
Good question. So again, the dose is always big enough to generate this big experience, not the psycholytic low dose experience. Our trials back then, it's funny back then, it's only been a few years, but we're in a different era already. Things are moving so quickly. Was tailored to the person's weight. So it was 0.3 milligrams per kilogram. And this is psilocybin, not mushrooms. These aren't the mushrooms. These are synthesized powder. That correlates to about 4 grams of dried mushrooms. So it's a pretty heavy dose.
Then.
Right, it's a high dose. But I do want to point out that we're now moving away from that model, and for a new trial that I'm writing up now, we're moving towards, and most of the trials are in America, and over in Europe as well, I believe now, moving towards a flat dose. And we're moving towards a 25 milligram psilocybin dose for most trials now. Johns Hopkins did a wonderful study at a dose, like a dependent dose scale, going from very low to very high doses. And there does seem to be a sweet spot in that 20 to 30 milligram range. I've guided people with 17 milligrams who have completely life-changing experiences. And I've guided sessions with people with 40, 50 milligrams who did not have the same experience. I think too much of medicine could create a lot of static and a lot of somatic arousal and be too much to navigate quickly. So there seems to be a sweet spot, and that seems to be the 20 to 30 milligram range of psilocybin. And I think the field is going towards that model, flat dose, 25 milligrams.
Thank you.
And the follow-up, you mentioned that you would like to do a study with people that are enlisting for assisted suicide. Are you aware of any studies or projects related to suicidality in general?
Yeah, so again, I'd like to do that. We're not doing that now, and a lot of people think that would be important because again, there was a study done recently. I just did a talk at a hospice event, and Ira Byack, who's this leading palliative care person in America, physician, he cited some research where the key indicator for being on that list, for applying for that list, was existential distress. So if that could be resolved, would that change that person's mind? There's no studies with that per se, but we did show in our research, and others have, that the desire for hastened death did decrease. And that's important. And we know that hopelessness and demoralization, those key constructs, are linked to a desire for a hastened death, for suicide. And if they're resolved, that desire dissipates. There's a whole body of literature outside of psychedelics and cancer on that. So that's very attractive, that model, that if we can resolve this suffering, that may change their direction of this desire for hastened death. But there's no studies yet, Philip. But I imagine there will be as the gates open for the research, more and more is going to happen.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a scary group to do research in at all, because if someone commits suicide, then it could be politically problematic.
Right. No one has yet, thankfully. And
Hmm.
if anything, we see a drop in those desires. And there's been now 3 studies here. There's the LSD study in Switzerland, and we're about to launch a new multi-site study throughout America with psilocybin. There are studies up in Boston in protocol development, NYU as well, separate from the multi-site that I'm doing. Emory. There's a study in Maryland right now with, I showed the picture before of my colleague Manish. They're doing psilocybin and advanced cancer and group process. And they're showing very good results. So far, it's not published, but anecdotally, it looks very promising. So these medicines appear to be safe, and that's very promising.
Thank you. I'll pass the word to Kyle.
Thanks, Tony, for that presentation. I love the breadth and depth of thinking. I came across, I think it was a qualitative study about different psychedelics, and including ketamine as well, and the experience in the medicine itself during that journey and near-death experiences. And they found that qualitatively ketamine was the closest, even compared to psilocybin. I think DMT might have been on that study too, to these near-death experiences. And I first came across ketamine when I was doing hospice work for end-of-life depression. Do you have any thoughts about, ketamine versus psilocybin for existential distress and end-of-life depression?
Yeah, I do, and I think a lot of it, even my thoughts are going to be premature in a way, because there isn't much studies done on ketamine yet. Of course, there are no trials with ketamine and end-of-life distress, clinical trial. So, part of this incredible landscape we find ourselves in, there's a lot of speculation about things, microdosing, ketamine, and it's fine. People can speculate and have ideas. But we like to see results. So there aren't clinical trials for microdosing or ketamine yet. So we will see. Yeah, I know that people, the ketamine experience can really generate this closeness to this kind of, and DMT as well, this quote unquote death experience. Of course, we're just speculating what death would be like. However, I as you would imagine, I lean towards psilocybin for a few reasons. One, the ketamine research shows a 2-week depression, the best of the ketamine trials that allowed it to be rescheduled, 2 or 3 weeks of reduction in depression, then that was it. Psilocybin is now showing it at 8 months and even longer. While ketamine can give exposure to that phenomenology in part, the classic hallucinogens, which ketamine is not, so those are LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, they have this, for me at least, there's the timeline, the 6-hour timeline that allows you to keep going back in to the experience versus even DMT, the short experiences. There's a kind of a softness to it that I think is very, this engages the patient really well. There's a track record, of course, we have throughout research and throughout history. And I think it seems to trigger some of these mystical experiences more consistently than ketamine, but I could be wrong, and we'll see what the research shows. I do hear over and over ketamine can produce these experiences in dramatic ways, and that's really promising. But sometimes the experience can be very different, the ketamine generated experience. So the jury's out. I'm prone to the psilocybin. I think it's a remarkable compound. The safety of it, the efficacy, the timeline, the history. It's a naturally organic growing mushroom on the planet. So it has such a package behind it that for us, it really is a great research tool. But I look forward to the ketamine trials. I look forward to research being done to compare.
Yeah, thank you. I know a lot of the trials to do like IV ketamine or lower
Right.
dose than what's done kind of off label right now. So that's a very different experience.
It's very different. You're exactly right. And I look forward to the next 5 years. I think we're going to see an explosion of research in all these areas. We can have answers versus just speculation.
Johan Rosenberg.
Sorry?
I just said Johan. Johan has the word.
Oh.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just wondering, was there an equal distribution between men and women who had the mystical experience, or was one more prone to have mystical experience?
Good question. I'm not got my data slide in front of me, but there were more women than men in the trial, both trials. So it is going to be weighted towards women. And I'm pretty sure that because of the unequal weight, even if you worked it out percentage-wise, it was weighted more towards women. But the ultimate answer, if we weighted it correctly and adjusted it, I'm not sure. But I could, I'll find that and get it. I'll get it to Philip. He can pass it on to you. Good question. But that, and I'm not sure the answers in these preliminary data are going to be so profound. But I do think that's the heart of the future. As we collect more and more and more of data points of patients, not just 50 or 100 or 200, but hundreds and thousands of patients, can we put together a typology, a map of who's having these experiences, what are the prerequisite factors. In our study, prior use didn't correlate, didn't matter for the mystical experience. Actually, I don't think gender mattered. I'm going to get back to it now. I'll send Philip a slide. I don't think gender mattered. Prior experience didn't matter, nor did spiritual orientation matter. Atheists, agnostics, and religious people, there was no difference. Half the people in our trial were agnostic or atheist, but it didn't matter. This language is kind of a human-generated language, but in the end, it's just about experience. But I believe gender does not correlate, but I'll follow up.
And to Marcus Hjort.
Yeah, you mentioned that seeing the Earth from space seems to be able to trigger a peak experience. Do you think that there's a clinical potential for providing non-drug induced mystical experiences?
I love that question. I absolutely love it. Yeah, I do. So, I mean, we know that through the overview effect, and there's some beautiful documentaries over the years that look at astronauts' experiences. Look, again, it's important to remember that these aren't solely because of psychedelics. The research shows that there was a Pew study done. I think I ran by it too quickly in my slideshow. 49% of Americans report having a mystical or religious experience of some sort in their life. Not a 4-hour experience, but these are the things that are written about by Jung and others, and Walt Whitman and Spinoza and millennia. So clearly we can generate these experiences through meditation, through other technologies, clearly not as profound as the psychedelic in terms of the duration, but all the great mystics, and you read their writings, the poets, and they're describing this. When I study, Buddhism and Hinduism and the Christian mystics, and I study all the language is this. How do they know this? They're all not taking medicine. So I think that question is wonderful. I think that's the biggest question. How do we connect with this part of who we are? If this is our essence, if this is the foundation of what humans are and is available to us all, why is it so separate? And how can we harness natural technologies that I think you're implying, meditation, other technologies, to generate this experience? It's remarkable. And I think, I hope we can. I think we can. And I think this opening the door now to the medicine. And I hope, my hope is that we don't just stay in a biological reductionism and it becomes a new Prozac, that we don't lose sight of it's the experience that's recalibrating people. Certainly the neuroplasticity matters. There's an openness, and that I think allows experience to be imprinted in a very enduring way. But it's the phenomenology of the experience. When people tell us, people always ask, what causes the change? And, you see it in the press, they don't know, the scientists don't know what the change is caused by yet. Well, yes, we do. People tell us. I mean, patients tell us, I feel better because this happened. Now, obviously, it's more complicated neuroscientifically what might be happening. but they're reporting these narratives of self-love, of connection, of meaning, of what matters in life. And I stopped, even people, there's a great story by Cary Grant. If you Google Cary Grant, the great American actor from the 1950s, it's a documentary on him as well. He had LSD psychotherapy when it was legal back in the 60s and 50s. And it changed his life. And he speaks about how it changed his life. He became less narcissistic and less materialistic and more caring. It changes who we are. So I think your question is great. Could this lead not just to more psychedelic research, but to, this peak mystical numinous experience research? How do we generate it reliably? And why is it so separate from who we are? Those are big theological questions that I can't answer, but I put out there.
Thank you.
We have a few more minutes, so I'm moving quickly on to Xenia.
Hi, thank you so much, Tony. It's such a meaningful sort of work you do, and such a great presentation. I really appreciate it. I guess I had more of a comment, really, not a question. So a friend of mine, well, not a very close, but still a friend of mine, was dying from very advanced cancer about 5 years ago. And she, I don't believe she had any experience with psychedelics. And she was in a lot of pain because of some problem with her insurance. She was like calling everyone she knew at that point, seeing if anyone has leftover, strong painkillers. So she called me with that. I was organizing. She badly wanted assisted suicide, but she couldn't get it in California 5 years ago. Therefore, she was doing that. And I did organize ayahuasca retreats at that point in California. And I really wanted for her to come. And I think by that point, I haven't heard of psychedelics in palliative care. 5, 6 years ago. So I wanted for her to come, and I invited her. And I mean, I think she was it was quite hard for her at that point. She never made it, but I guess I'm left. She passed, and I'm left wondering, how her experience could have been somewhat different had she come, at least once, participated in the ceremony. Thank you.
Yeah. It's hard to think of how people could have been helped, and they didn't have access to it. And that's why we hope we're able to move this forward. I think in 5 or 7 years or less, this will be rescheduled. MDMA will be rescheduled sooner, but MDMA is different. I mean, MDMA is such an incredible medicine, and cultivating this empathically aligned experience that can help in so many profound ways. And clearly the PTSD literature is incredible. The thinking in our field is that it's this big ontologic shift and this big change that seems to trigger the enduring effects with end of life distress, because it really recalibrates people what death might even be, versus MDMA, which may not have those dramatic experiences, but has such a profound heart-opening experience that has its own profound therapeutic potential. And that'll be probably rescheduled in 2 or 3 years. I think psilocybin's 5 or so, but who knows? It's a rapidly changing landscape. Maybe it's tomorrow. I don't know.
We are at 8:30 already, so I'm going to finish the recording. Thank you very much, Tony, for being with us. It's so generous and kind to engage with the community like this. See you all next week, when we will actually be doing a public webinar next week. So it's not a member webinar, but a public webinar to celebrate the launch of Kyle Ortego's book, Beyond the Narrow Life.
It was a pleasure to be here. I wish you all well, and I hope to see you at some point on this planet together.
Thank you.